Welcome and thank you for standing by. At this time, I'd like to inform all participants that today's call is being recorded. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. You have been placed in a listen-only mode for the duration of today's conference. I would now like to turn the call over to Ms. Karen Battle. Thank you, ma'am. You may begin.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the National Advisory Committee meeting on differential privacy. I am Karen Battle, the designated federal officer for the National Advisory Committee. The Census Bureau has convened the NAC today to discuss differential privacy and disclosure avoidance. On behalf of the Census Bureau, I would like to thank everyone who has joined us to observe the meeting. During this public meeting, NAC members may ask questions, make comments, and offer recommendations to the Census Bureau. At 4 p.m. Eastern Time, all other attendees will have the opportunity to submit public comments via the WebEx platform. I will then read all submissions, and they may be posted on the NAC website. They will be posted on the NAC website. Also, please note that closed captioning services are also available. James Tucker, with Cherokee Bradley's assistance, will facilitate the committee discussion today. Members, to join the queue for questions and comments, I ask that you use the virtual raise hand icon found on the lower right corner of the WebEx platform. Once you are acknowledged by the chair, unmute your line, state your name clearly for the record, and proceed with your question or comment. First on today's agenda, our committee chair, James Tucker, will provide opening remarks. Following James Tucker's remarks, Michael Hawes and Rolando Rodriguez will present research on alternatives to differential privacy, followed by committee discussion. We'll stop briefly for a 10-minute break. After the break, we will have Carol Heffert present the Differential Privacy Working Group deliverables. We will then have the public comment period. Following the public comment period, the WebEx platform and conference bridge will remain open while the committee engages in deliberation. At 5:20 p.m., we will reconvene for the presentation of the NAC differential privacy recommendations, as well as any remaining recommendations from the May 6 and 7 NAC spring meeting. We will then adjourn at 6 p.m. So with that, I will now turn the meeting over to James Tucker, who will offer chair remarks.
James Tucker, it's Shauna Bank. I think you're muted.
James appears to be muted.
Yeah. James, this is Shauna Bank.
Operator, is there a way that you can let the speaker know to unmute his line, please?
Yes, I will do that. And his line is open, so give me 1 second. We're taking care of that for you.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I'm so sorry. I feel terrible about that. Sorry about that. And I apologize for losing a minute. I just want to, again, get started by saying the Bureau should be applauded for its transparency in the DAS, its consultations with its stakeholders and the public, and for its ongoing efforts to address concerns about the impact of DAS on particular population groups. The development and application of differential privacy through the DAS is a remarkable technical achievement. Never before has a plan been developed to apply differential privacy to such a large data set, much less our nation's decennial census data. And it's fair to say that it is not just those in our nation watching what the Bureau is doing, but the whole world. Many other countries are considering the Bureau's efforts in evaluating whether to apply differential privacy to their own census data. At the same time, it is important to recognize that many stakeholders and civil rights organizations believe that the privacy concerns raised by the Bureau are overstated. As Bureau experts acknowledge, commercially available search engines that we use every day allow even the most unsophisticated data user to readily identify personally identifiable information about nearly any person they want. Moreover, many of us believe that the Bureau's reliance on Title 13 privacy requirements as a mandate to apply differential privacy to the decennial census data is erroneous. In addition, there are widespread concerns that the Census Bureau may be rushing in its embrace of differential privacy. That concern is made clear by the mere fact that the Bureau has continued to make changes to the top-down algorithm, is releasing demonstration data, is soliciting feedback from stakeholders, and is making adjustments to the privacy loss budget after the 2020 census data has been collected, and while it is undergoing quality review in preparation for final processing. And while the Bureau has made significant progress in its development of the DAS, it remains clear that much work still remains to be done. It raises a foundational question of whether it is even appropriate to apply the DAS at this point. With a decennial census, while it remains an imperfect solution striking the right balance between accuracy and privacy, wouldn't it be better to wait until the DAS is improved? Furthermore, it's important that what must inform, regardless of the decision that the Bureau ultimately takes on differential privacy, what must inform both the final decisions of the Bureau and DCEP is this mandate. Regardless of what privacy protections are put in place, no population group can be left behind. Notwithstanding the considerable technical achievements the Bureau has made in a very short time, and they truly are remarkable, we continue to see anomalies that are concerning. Places with populations of 500 people or less, which comprise over 1/4 of all incorporated places in this country, are disproportionately impacted by the DAS. Some populations do not appear where they should. Smaller minority groups in a community frequently are diminished in population to enhance the numbers for the largest minority group. In the most sparsely populated communities, even the loss of a small number of people has significant fiscal and representational consequences. We also do not yet know what population groups, if any, will see an undercount from the 2020 census. Many of the quality indicators released to date suggest concerning trends for some of the hardest to count populations. There is anxiety among many that application of the DAS will only exacerbate the disparate impact that hard-to-count populations may experience if, as appears likely, some of those groups were undercounted during census field operations. These are all difficult questions that should be considered today as the NAC meets and makes its recommendations, and when DCEP meets to consider the disclosure avoidance system. I fully expect that we will have a robust conversation on these and other related concerns today. And in closing, I just want to reiterate the appreciation that all NAC members and stakeholders have for the Census Bureau's ongoing efforts to engage with us to discuss these critical issues. The only thing I'm going to mention just in way of closing is a logistical point to NAC members. We will be finalizing our recommendations in open session. It will be a little bit different from last time. And so if you have a recommendation during the course of the discussion presentations, please go ahead and post it in the chat to the panelists. And then Cherokee, Bradley, and I will make sure that they're incorporated in the draft recommendations. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Karen Battle. Thanks so much. And I apologize again for the technical snafu on my end.
All right. Thank you very much, James. Now, please welcome Michael Hawes and Rolando Rodriguez, who will present research on alternatives to differential privacy, followed by committee discussion.
Great. Thank you, Karen. I'm Michael Hawes. In early June, the Census Bureau's Data Stewardship Executive Policy Committee, DCEP, will be making decisions regarding the privacy loss budget for the Public Law 94-171 Redistricting Data Summary File. We've gotten a lot of questions about how DCEP will be making this decision and what information they'll be considering when doing so. Most of the inputs to that decision-making will be various accuracy metrics that we've been analyzing with the working group and with other stakeholder groups over the last several months. And in addition to those accuracy measures, we'll also be looking closely at the extensive feedback and analyses that we've been receiving from our data users who have been evaluating the April 2021 demonstration data product. But to contextualize the impacts of these decisions, DCEP will also be looking at what the impacts on privacy and accuracy would be for some alternative disclosure avoidance methods. This presentation will examine the results of some of the research that we've been conducting into possible alternatives that DCEP will be considering as they make their decisions about the privacy loss budget for the redistricting data. Next slide, please. The selection and implementation of any disclosure avoidance method will impose a fundamental trade-off between the degree of data protection on the one hand and either the quantity, accuracy, or fitness for use of the data on the other. These impacts on the usability of the data are not a byproduct of confidentiality protection. They are the mechanism by which you can protect privacy and confidentiality. Next slide. At its simplest, you can think of the trade-off between privacy and accuracy as a spectrum. On the one extreme, you have perfect privacy with completely useless data. At the other extreme, you have perfect data with no privacy protections. The key is to find the point in between these extremes where the data are sufficiently accurate to meet their intended uses while being sufficiently protected to meet your legal and ethical obligations to safeguard the data. Now, in reality, this simple two-dimensional representation of the trade-off is an oversimplification. Quantity of the data, granularity or detail of the data, and the relative accuracy of different tabulations are all different dimensions to consider, as are protections against different types of privacy attacks. But for illustration purposes, this spectrum highlights the basic problem to solve. Next slide, please. That said, once you've identified that point where the data are sufficiently private and sufficiently accurate, that point on that spectrum becomes your privacy loss budget. And you'll see this represented either as the acronym PLB, the Greek letter epsilon, or the Greek letter rho, depending on the context. Next slide, please. Now, determining that optimal point, that optimal privacy loss budget, is a policy decision, and it's a difficult policy decision at that. And as I mentioned before, there are many factors that are going to go into that decision-making. The relative accuracy of different tabulations within the data and how well they will meet our data users' needs for various priority uses of census data. Analyses of the relative privacy risk versus various types of privacy attacks that could be mounted against the published census data. The feedback that we've received from our data users and other stakeholders, and much, much more. Next slide, please. But, as I mentioned, it's also helpful to think, okay, what would the alternative be? What would the relative privacy or the relative accuracy be were we to use different methods? And understanding what those impacts are can really help contextualize the privacy accuracy trade-off in the decision-making that DCEP needs to make. So we determined that it was important to do research into what the relative impacts on privacy and accuracy would be of the most likely alternatives to our disclosure avoidance system. And so now my colleague, Rolando Rodriguez, is going to present the results of some of the research that we've been conducting into plausible alternative disclosure avoidance methodologies for the census.
All right, thank you, Michael. Next slide, please. I want to start off by giving some background on the DAS reconstruction team and the efforts that team has been making since early last year, more innocent times, on the issues of these alternatives that would, to formal privacy methods. Next slide, please. So I'd like to emphasize that the DAS reconstruction team is a separate team and has separate staff from either the DAS science or DAS DevOps team. Those teams continue their strenuous efforts to make the top-down algorithm ready for final 2020 census production. So that being said, in February of last year, a group in the Center for Enterprise Dissemination Disclosure Avoidance area was organized at first to assess the potential impacts of the 2010 swapping algorithm and extensions of that algorithm. That team has since become the DAS reconstruction team, and we have performed numerous swapping experiments and have also recently begun to look at the potential impacts of table and cell suppression on 2010 census data. Next slide. So I'm going to start off by talking about suppression and experiments that we did on the 2010 census data based upon 1980 census suppression rules using race categories from OMB. Next slide. So I'll start off with a bit of background on what suppression is. So suppression involves removing information from tables that you might have published in order to protect privacy. So in the 1980 census, there were two kinds of suppression used. Table suppression, which involves deleting tables that fail to meet certain thresholds, for instance, for the total number of records that feed into the table, and cell suppression, which involves deleting individual table cells that fail to meet certain thresholds. Of those two, cell suppression is typically the harder one to implement because you have to worry about the issue of complementary suppression. Next slide, please. So to show you how cell suppression works, just to give a background on what is this complementary suppression. We may have a two-way table that we wish to release, and we might also wish to release the margins of that table. We see here we might have a rule, for instance, that says if any of the table cells are below, say, 5, you have to suppress that particular cell. So in this table we see here, you have a value of 2 for one of the categories, so we would suppress that value based upon the rule. This suppression is called a primary cell suppression. And as it turns out, you have to do more than this to actually protect the cell value you intended to. Next slide, please. So as it turns out, if you're going to report the margins of a particular table, and this happens often in data releases like the census, you might report a table of age by sex, but also a table of sex alone and age alone. So in this two-way case, if you had the suppressed value S here, but you also gave out the margins, you can use simple subtraction to get back the value of S. No real hard math involved at all. So what you have to end up doing is what is called complementary suppressions. You have to prevent that kind of algebra from being done to solve back for the cells you are trying to protect. And in the case of a two-way table with both margins have been reported, you in fact have to end up suppressing the entire table to make that happen. So these complementary suppressions can greatly add to the total amount of suppression that you have to do for cells if that is one of the privacy methods you intend to implement. Next slide, please. So the counterfactual world that we're dealing with here is that we have the 1980 census rules for suppression being applied to the 2010 census data with categories of race and ethnicity as used by OMB and implemented by the Department of Justice voting section. So we looked at the impact of these rules on two sets of tables, the PL94171 redistricting data from 2010 and the Census Summary File 1 products from 2010, which in 2020 will be the Demographic Housing and Characteristics file, the DHC. And I have also listed here the OMB race categories that we use. They are basically the 7 major race categories, either alone or in combination with white, with a catch-all 2 or more races category, and then a simple binary Hispanic or Latino versus not Hispanic and not Latino category for ethnicity. Next slide, please. So for the PL94 data tables, for the redistricting tables, there were 2 rules from 1980 that would be applied. So for table suppression, there was a rule that if any of the race or ethnicity groups for a particular geography had between 1 and 14 people, then any table that was not a table solely of race or ethnicity or race by ethnicity would have been suppressed. So for the PL94 tables, this rule would apply to 2 of them. Table P3, which is race for the voting age population, and table P4, which is ethnicity by race for the voting age population. The additional suppression rule that would have applied was cell suppression. So that rule was that any cells of only 1 or 2 would be replaced by 0. That applied to 2 other PL94 tables, so P1, which is race, and P2, which is ethnicity or Hispanic or Latino by race. Additionally, we looked at a set of suppression rules from 1980 that would have applied to the 2010 SF1 tables if we had applied them in 2010. For table suppression, the rule is that whole tables that are not solely dedicated to, again, to race or ethnicity would have been suppressed if the geography associated with the table had between 1 and 14 people. So you're suppressing tables for small geographies, essentially. This applied to all person-level tables in the SF1 product. Next slide, please. So I just want to talk a bit about what the impact of suppression rules could be on privacy risk if they were used on a product like the 2010 census. So suppression, if done correctly, can remove information completely from tables that are released. That means if you do enough of it, if you do enough table suppression, enough cell suppression, you can prevent the kind of reconstruction-embedded re-identification attacks as the Census Bureau did previously on the 2010 census. So while suppression could eliminate the risk of that specific kind of attack on a specific set of tables, it's still not equivalent to the kind of broad privacy guarantees that come from using formal privacy methods and definitions such as differential privacy or the zero concentrated differential privacy for the 2020 census. Next slide, please. So I'll go over some of the results that we've found for suppression. I'll start off with the PL94 tables. So these are redistricting data. Again, for tables P1, which is race, and P2, which is ethnicity by race, cell suppression would have been applied based upon the 1980 rules. So again, cell counts of 1 or 2 are suppressed. In this case, the implementation was they were made 0. I should note that the margin of these tables, so the total population per block, down to the block level, I should say, would not have been suppressed in 1980. And note that these results that I show include only the primary suppressions that I talked about earlier. These don't include the numbers for any complementary suppressions. Again, getting the set of total complementary suppressions is quite a hard problem to do, and you need software, not hands, to do it. Again, those kinds of suppressions are necessary to keep this reconstruction of the cells, primary cells, from happening due to marginal counts. So for table P1, we can see that our rates of cell suppression range from a low of 2.4 at the county level, 2.4% at the county level, up to 10% of the cells at the block group level. For table P2, which is a more detailed table than P1, it will naturally have more suppression done to it. There, we have a low of around 7% of the cells at the county level suppressed, up to a high of 14.5% of the cells suppressed at the block group level. So again, this is if we had applied these 1980 rules using the OMB race categories to the 2010 census edited file. Next slide, please. Tables P3 and P4, since they cross race and ethnicity by another demographic, in this case voting age, would have had table suppression applied rather than cell suppression. And as you can see from these results here, the amount of table suppression that would have happened to these would have been high, extremely high in some cases. So for table P3, already at the county level, over 50% of the tables would have been, over 50% of the geographies would have had table P3 suppressed. So over 50% of counties would not have P3 reported. This goes up to a maximum of 95.7% of the block groups would not have had table P3 reported. And then around 84% of the blocks. For table P4, since again it is a more detailed table than P3, it is ethnicity by race for the voting age population, the suppression would be even higher. At the county level, more than 84% of counties would have had table P4 suppressed. For the block groups, essentially all of the block groups would have had their table suppressed for table P4. And at the block level, over 87%. So this is a large amount of suppression. And if you go to data.census.gov and look at some of the outputs for 2010, you'll see that these numbers make sense. There are lots of geographies that have a small number of certain race groups or ethnicity groups. So under this regime, they would be suppressed in large amounts. Next slide, please. So we did consider one type of suppression that did not occur in 1980, and that would be cell suppression for tables P3 and P4. So we considered a rule in which we would add voting age as part of the cell suppression criteria. And as you can see here, again, these are primary suppressions only. Similar numbers to what we saw for tables P1 and P2 for cell suppression at the county level for P3, around 4% of the cells changed, up to a high of 13.5% of the cells at the block group level. For table P4, over 9% of the cells at the county level, up to a high of over 70% of the cells at the block group level. Next slide, please. Finally, we looked at the impact of the additional rule for SF1 tables based upon just the total number of people in the geography. So, the SF1 tables would include your tables that have more detailed age and sex categories in them, as well as more detail on other variables as well. Here at the blocks level, for SF1 person tables, over 38% of blocks would have their SF1 tables, again, other than just race and just ethnicity, would have those tables suppressed. For the housing unit tables, which I didn't list the rule here, but it was that you have to have if you have between 1 and 4 occupied housing units in the geography, you have suppression. The housing unit tables, at the block level, 32.8% of blocks would have had their housing unit table, SF1 table suppressed. Next slide, please. So now having gone through suppression, I'll talk about our experiments that we've done with the Census 2010 swapping algorithm and relaxations and extensions of that algorithm. Next slide, please. So just to go a little background on how swapping works, in 2010, the swapping was done on the housing unit level. So one housing unit was swapped with another housing unit. You first determine a key to match the units. So in the illustration I have here, we're using the number of people within the housing unit to be the matching key. So you can only swap if you match on that key. You then have to choose which geographies you're going to swap between, and then those you're going to swap within. So here we're swapping between blocks, but within, say, tract or county or state. You then usually have some kind of algorithm for determining which units are going to be swapped. You could swap 100% of units, but oftentimes there's a selection criteria that is chosen. Then you select a rate at which you want the swaps to occur. So you determine eligibles for swaps, then you determine what percentage of the eligibles get swapped, and then you find the pairs. So in this case, these two housing units that were chosen for swapping match on the matching criteria, and thus they could be potential swap pairs for each other. Next slide, please. So the initial efforts of the DAS reconstruction team were to adapt the 2010 census swapping algorithm to support arbitrary swapping rates, up to 100% if necessary. So the algorithm as we now have it supports the following parameters and adjustments to those parameters. We can select any swap rate from 0 to 100%. We can take the list of invariants, so this is the swap key that has to match between housing units. And we have mechanisms for relaxing those invariants and for extending swaps beyond, say, the tract level into counties and across state. Next slide. So the DAS reconstruction team has prepared many of these swapping experiments. We've tested swap rates from 5% up to 50% of housing units. We've also applied perturbation to the housing unit size and to the geography before we do the swapping. So for housing unit size, we assign a pseudo housing unit size of ±1 to the housing unit, and we tested that for up to 80% of housing units. For the geographic perturbation, we assigned a pseudo tract to the housing unit and before doing swapping, and we tested that for up to 70% of housing units. So at the beginning of this year, this calendar year, the reconstruction team began to assess the impact that these parameters would have on the reconstruction embedded re-identification attack that had been performed on the 2010 census. So in other words, we're seeing how various iterations of the swapping parameters would have affected our outcomes on reconstruction and re-identification. Next slide. So here are some of the results from these swapping experiments. And the key outcomes are that if we pick a low swap rate, they have essentially no impact on our re-identification outcomes. We get essentially the same numbers as we did on the original 2010 reconstruction embedded re-identification attack. If we choose a high swap rate, even with a large amount of perturbation associated with it, we get only a minimal impact on our re-identification outcomes. And if we then look at the accuracy metrics, the same accuracy metrics that have been being used for the privacy-protected microdata files out of the disclosure avoidance system for 2020, we get accuracy metrics inferior to those, especially for the April release of the DAS PPMF that just occurred. So if we put all this together, that means there's going to be some middling rate of swapping, and say with perturbation, where we could match the top-down algorithm in terms of its accuracy output, but we're never going to have a huge impact on our re-identification outcomes. And so if you look at some of those outcomes, for the original 2010 experiment, the putative rate of re-identification in the population was 44.6%. The confirmation rate, so the total percent of cases confirmed in the population, was almost 17%. Put together, that gives us a precision, that is the number of times we can confirm one of the putative re-identifications, of 37.79%. So that's our baseline. We want to do better than this. I have here two swapping experiments. One I'm calling swap low. Swap low had a 5% rate with no perturbation of household size or geography. As you can see here, the numbers stay essentially the same in terms of re-identification. We did another experiment, which I'm calling swap high, that was a 50% swap, where 50% of the housing units got a perturbation in their housing unit size before the swap, and 70% of the housing units got a perturbation to their tract before the swap.
Thank you.
That reduced the putative rate of identification only down to 42.69%, reduced the confirmed rate only down to around 13%, and left it with a precision, that is how often is the attacker getting things right, still over 30%. Next slide, please. So if we then look at some of the accuracy outcomes for our swapping experiments, here I have the mean absolute error for the total population, both for counties on the left and for incorporated places on the right. I have here the results for the April release of the PPMF, the swap high experiment and the swap low experiment. You can see here that compared to the April PPMF, the swap low experiment, of course, has low error because the swap rate is very low. But again, it does nothing for our re-identification outcomes. The swap high experiment also has a minimal effect on re-identification. It has a much larger effect upon these mean absolute errors at the county and place level. Next slide. If we extend this to looking at, for instance, the mean absolute error across races alone at the county level, we see similar results. So at this scale, the errors for both the swap low experiment and the April PPMF were essentially invisible. That's because they're dominated by the errors that happened from the swap high experiment. So much more perturbation we're seeing, at least in terms of this metric, for each race from a high swap rate. And again, it really doesn't do much for us in terms of reconstruction and re-identification. Next slide, please. So just some final considerations for NAC. So none of the algorithms that I've talked about here, either suppression or swapping, adheres to a formal privacy definition or has a semantic for privacy loss. We can't quantify how much attackers are learning from our releases with these methods. And we're only assessing them based upon this one attack strategy, which was the reconstruction embedded re-identification attack done on the 2010 census. Note that on Wednesday, the Census Scientific Advisory Committee reminded everyone that that attack is in fact a conservative attack. You can do stronger attacks based upon the census tables alone, let alone getting higher quality external data into the mix. The implementation of the 1980-based suppression rules, if we had done them on the 2010 census using the OMB race categories, would have led to extreme amounts of table suppression for sub-state on-spine geographies, so for counties, tracts, block groups, and blocks. Implementations and relaxations of the 2010 census swapping algorithm would yield little improvement in our reconstruction and re-identification outcomes, even at high swap rates, and at those high swap rates would have a large impact on our accuracy metrics. And finally, an important note is that if we did want to make a production implementation of either the suppression or the swapping algorithm, we would expect that to take at least an additional 6 months after any decision was made to implement these methods. So, thank you.
So, James, I think we are pushing up against the break. Would you like to begin committee discussion, or what would you like to do?
I don't see any questions in the queue, and I don't see anyone. I suspect there may be some people who may be interested in asking questions, but I guess I'll just pose one, and then perhaps we will go at 12:10.
Okay.
So just to make clear, what you're basically talking about is if differential privacy is not used as part of the disclosure avoidance system, these are basically the alternatives, and again, you've identified what some of the limitations are of those alternatives. I think it's implied in what you're saying, but I think it would be great just to be explicit that that's what you're really saying.
Yeah, so the point of these experiments was to serve as information for DCEP to consider what alternatives might cause to happen compared to what we're seeing from the disclosure avoidance system.
Okay, thanks so much. I still don't see any questions in the queue. And so what I'm going to suggest is perhaps we do go to break, and then if you perhaps could hang around and come back to the next portion. If anyone has any questions at that point, we can definitely get them in the queue and even address them right before we go to Carol Heffert. Thanks so much for the presentation. It was really, really informative.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Rolando and Michael. Thank you, James. So now we will take a short break, and we will reconvene at 3:20.
Thank you for standing by. Today's conference will now continue. I'd now like to turn the call back over to Karen Battle. Thank you, ma'am. You may begin.
Thank you, and welcome back to the NAC Differential Privacy meeting. We will now hear from Carol Heffert, who will provide us with the Differential Privacy Working Group deliverables.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for meeting with us today. I'm Carol Heffert. I'm a principal research scientist at NORC at the University of Chicago. And on behalf of the NAC this afternoon, I'll be presenting some analyses based on the demonstration products, discussing the implications of these analyses, and then setting the stage for the recommendations that the NAC will be presenting later this afternoon. Before I begin, I would like to thank the members of the Differential Privacy Work Group and other stakeholders for their contributions to these remarks. Next slide, please. These are broadly the topics that I'll be sharing. implications, and need for stakeholder engagement, and then opening things up for discussion. Next slide, please. Before I begin, though, I would like to acknowledge on behalf of the NAC that we recognize the technical complexity of this effort and applaud the Census Bureau for its efforts. We recognize that the Bureau has made improvements in the past few months with the latest release of the demonstration data for the disclosure avoidance system, both in terms of the algorithm, technical changes for small populations, and the increased privacy loss budget. We also thank the Bureau for sharing the results of its ongoing refinement of the DAS with the Differential Privacy Work Group and seeking feedback from others in the data user community, tribal nations, civil rights organizations, and others. We appreciate the Bureau's efforts over the past year amid the pandemic and in a challenging legal environment to conduct the decennial count and to fulfill constitutional requirements for congressional redistricting and the release of the data products, including the PL94 restricting data. Having said that, it is important to note that there are challenges to implementing differential privacy and protecting the data, and that there are profound and real-world implications to address. Next slide, please. So just recapping a bit of what we had heard in the previous presentation, the privacy interest is based on the Title 13 requirements not to publish exact identifying information and to protect against re-identification attacks. And given that we live in a big data world, this is very critical, but at the same time, it raises the question about what we might lose in this balancing act. And if we think of this as two conditional statements, if the privacy loss parameter is set to favor utility, then the benefits are lowered. If it's set to favor privacy, then the utility benefits are lowered. So this presents a quandary for balancing the risk of disclosure with the usefulness of the data products. It's a quandary for what is ideal and what is practical. It raises concerns about equality and equity in how populations are affected. Next slide, please. In using differential privacy, it's important to understand what data will change and what data won't. So what won't change, what remains invariant or as enumerated, that state total population, which is already reflected in the apportionment data that the Census Bureau released in April, the total number of housing units in each census block, the number and type of each group quarters unit in each census block. But what will change and be subjected to the noise and not reported as enumerated using differential privacy will be population, voting population, age population. So we need to consider what are the practical and justice-oriented implications of this trade-off for redistricting and for hard-to-count population groups. And one clear implication is that race and ethnicity data are likely to be farther from what is enumerated than in past decades when data swapping or suppression was used to protect small populations. And it's important to recognize that this will impact and most likely affect the most marginalized members of our society. Next slide, please. So in the next couple of slides, I will briefly summarize some of these implications based on analyses of the data products done by organizations that are represented on the NAC. So concerns raised in one series of analyses and case studies of the redistricting data using the April 2021 PPMF and a conservative privacy loss budget of 4.5 found that as the largest minority population is prioritized in the privacy loss budget, smaller minority groups often see more drastic fluctuation in the population counts as a consequence. So in many cases, the largest minority population adds people at the expense of smaller minority populations. So the loss of data, meaning people, has implications for changes in federal funding, allocations, state spending, and with downstream consequences for local and tribal governance. It also manifests itself potentially as decreased political representation. The analyses also noted that this can dilute geographic compactness, which is essential to establishing minority voting districts. An example being that reallocation of American Indian, Alaska Native populations at the census block level raises concerns about misrepresenting that compactness and diluting its stature as a majority-minority district if the population, for instance, moves across a county or a state boundary. Another concern from these analyses is that differential privacy may have significant negative consequences for redistricting less populated places and other less populated local government bodies, such as school districts and special districts. So again, seeing the downstream consequences of what happens with when applying differential privacy to these data. Next slide, please. Additional implications beyond just redistricting are federal, state, and local appropriations, data used by state, tribal, and local governments for evaluating public programs and making policy decisions based on that data, and general academic research could be affected as well. Next slide, please. Further considerations regarding the implications for the race and ethnic total population data. In one examination of the data products, it was found that changes in total population affected the equal population requirement for redistricting. And this is taking the analyses at two separate points in time. So looking at the 2010 data products shared in 2019, the first product, the fourth product released in November 2020, reveals differential and concerning findings. The analyses of the first demonstration product showed small population counties tend to become more minority. But by the time the fourth analysis, the fourth demonstration product was released, that analysis showed that small counties went from generally gaining Latino, non-Latino Asian, non-Latino Black, and non-Latino American Indian, Alaska Native populations to losing racial and ethnic minority population on average. So in other words, in the fourth demonstration product, researchers found more of a gain in non-Latino white population in these counties, meaning that these counties are losing minority population. Next slide, please. And these concerns are supported by other analyses of the demonstration products that have raised questions about the accuracy of counts of the American Indian Alaska Native population on reservations and in smaller communities with populations less than 500 people at those lower level geographies. And the application of differential privacy to Black households and blocks that are already undocumented, especially undercounted, especially in 2020. So, for instance, Black men between the ages of 18 and 49 have the highest omission rate of all racial and ethnic groups. Black children were undercounted by 6.3% in the 2020 census. So concerning questions around the omission of an erasure, if you will, of certain groups by using differential privacy. These groups are already undercounted, and this impacts then equal representation and voting rights under the law. And it also has the potential of exacerbating unresolved issues related to this differential undercount for Black households and for Black immigrant populations as well. Next slide, please. So with these concerns, the NAC calls on the Bureau to, as we move forward, to increase its engagement, not only with the scientific community, but with community members that will be affected as reflected across the composition of the NAC, and with state, local, and tribal stakeholders who are most affected by these consequential shifts in counts, in representation, and potential funding and services that adhering to the differential privacy algorithm will create. In closing, and before opening this up for discussion, the differential privacy work group does have a fourth pending deliverable, which is to develop strategies for communicating the use of differential privacy for the data products and providing recommendations for messaging and communication strategies, and informing data users of all skill levels about what it is, the protection it provides, and that privacy accuracy trade-off, as we saw presented in the spectrum that Michael Hawes had shared. But we also need to begin a frank and national level discussion of its strengths, limitations, and the practical limitations that I have just shared, just only a very small piece of. So with that, I will open this up for discussion, and I thank you all for listening.
Okay, so I am looking at the queue. We currently have 2 people in the queue. I understand, Tom, that John Abowd may have answered some of your questions, but we're going to put you first in the queue, and then next will be Jerry Green. And then just to remind folks, please stay muted when you're not speaking, and either indicate in the chat or raise your hand if you would like to speak. So I'm turning it over to Tom.
Thanks, Jim, and thank you, Carol, and yes, thank you, Dr. Abowd did answer one of my questions about the presentation on alternatives, but my other question was just confirming that the alternatives, both suppression and swapping, that were evaluated are implementable on the current data release schedule, or was that not considered in identifying the alternatives? And then I did have 2 more questions related more broadly to differential privacy and the PL file. And those are, I'll just give them both. One, and we've heard this, I think, but I want to get it nailed down as of right now. What specific electoral districts has the Bureau evaluated, or will the Bureau evaluate in looking at the application of differential privacy to the PL file? My recollection is that there are 25 districts or something like that that the Bureau has looked at or will look at, and I just want to nail down that question. And then my last question is just to confirm that basically, if there is I'll say it as a fact. So in using the PL file for redistricting and enforcing the Voting Rights Act, there are more or less established turning points where a district becomes majority minority or not. So it may be 50% that for particular minority groups, it may be higher, 55 for other minority groups, and that's primarily related to citizenship rates and age differences between populations, et cetera. But whatever that marginal point of transition between majority minority and not being majority minority, that under differential privacy, there's really no way of preventing some marginal change in districts' geographies that are majority minority. In other words, all you can do is try to minimize those changes as much as possible, but there is no way to eliminate under differential privacy the phenomenon that some theoretical number of districts at that margin will flip from one side to the other. I hope those 3 questions are clear. One about the alternatives and their implementability, the second about what specific electoral districts the Bureau has looked at or will look at, and the third, just recognizing that you are looking to minimize flips at the margin, but there's really no way to prevent any flips.
This is Michael Hawes. I can answer those questions, Jim, if you want me to.
Yes, that would be great. Thank you so much, Michael.
Great. All right, so to your first question about timing, so remember the research that Rolanda was presenting on was research about or intended to inform decision-making about what the consequences of alternatives would be to inform parameter selection for the 2020 disclosure avoidance system using the top-down algorithm. So none of this was intended for implementation. Were the Census Bureau to change its algorithms and adopt a different disclosure avoidance methodology at this point, from start to finish, that would likely take 6 to 7 months to implement, because the methodology would have to be developed, evaluated, then it would have to be coded and tested. It would have to go through the full system integration testing that all decennial census IT systems have to go through. And from start to finish, that process for any algorithm change at this point would likely take 6 to 7 months. So in short, no, they could not be adopted within the current production schedule. To your second question about what voting districts we were looking at, in addition to the suite of districts that were examined in Tommy Wright and Kyle Iramata's paper, we have also been looking at other voting districts, both congressional districts, state upper house districts, state lower house districts, and additional ones that have been provided to us from redistricting experts and other data users in terms of their analyses. So we have been looking at a broad swath of different types of voting districts in terms of the evaluation of the latest demonstration data set. So much more than just the 25 that you referenced. And to your third question, sorry, forgive me, I'm trying to now remember. I was focused on the first two, and now I've forgotten what the third one was.
I just wanted to confirm, Michael, that you can't ensure that there's no flips at the margin.
Right.
There's a 50% or 55%, whatever it is. You're just working to minimize that possibility.
Yes, but I'll put an asterisk on that. Yeah, I mean, there is going to be, the introduction of noise is going to cause some uncertainty there. But it's important to recognize that that is no different than the uncertainty that was introduced in racial and ethnicity characteristics in prior censuses with swapping. And it certainly, with the latest set of parameters that were reflected in the demonstration data in April, that amount of uncertainty that's being added is well below the amount of error that's inherent in the actual kind of operations of the census itself. So yes, the introduction of noise through our top-down algorithm, that there is going to be some deviation from the ground truth, so to speak, but that amount is substantially less than the amount that would be due from other sources, and it's no different in terms of its type than the amount of uncertainty in those characteristics that was introduced through other disclosure avoidance methods.
So, Tom, I want to make sure that answered all of your questions.
It did. I might just follow up, Michael. Is the Bureau going to release any more about the other voting districts that you did look at? Is that anticipated at this point? I mean, I appreciate your response, but it doesn't give me what I'm looking for in terms of the scope, variety, geographic scope, variety of kinds of voting districts that were looked at. Is that something that the Bureau will release at some point?
I can't say what is currently being planned in terms of release on that. If you provide feedback on what types of those analyses you would like to see, we can certainly consider whether we can produce them for you.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tom. And with that, we'll turn it over to Jerry Green. And Jerry, you're muted. You're doing my mistake, making my mistake. Still can't hear you. No, can't hear you. Yeah, I think you're still muted. While you're trying to figure that out, I'm going to just ask a follow-up question, Michael, real quick. Do you happen to know among the districts, the voting districts that you looked at, did you look at any in very small places, like very sparsely populated places that might have people of 500 or less? Did you examine any that involved like school districts or maybe small, more sparsely populated special districts like water districts and sanitation districts?
That is an excellent question. The analyses that I've been doing have been focusing on state legislative districts. I know there are others who have been looking at metrics for geographies like school districts, et cetera, but I don't have the full list in front of me right now.
Okay, and then Jerry, I don't know, it looks like we still can't hear you. Maybe if you type your question in chat, that would be great. I'm going to go to Flo in just 1 second, but I have just kind of one follow-up because I think it kind of gets to the question that Tom had. Because the Bureau has been very transparent and it puts out a lot of reports. For example, we expect that, the recap of the 2020 census, you'll be putting out information just talking about the quality review and the undercount. Do you expect that you will be putting out any kind of paper or report that kind of walks through the iterations of all of the changes that you've made to both the algorithm and the privacy loss budget in the context of the feedback that you've gotten from various stakeholders? Because I think that sort of evolution and how it's been developed would be really, really helpful to a lot of people.
I do anticipate that we'll be releasing some documentation about kind of what we gained from the feedback we've been receiving, and we've been receiving some excellent feedback from our stakeholders that has some of which has already turned into improvements in the system, even based on the last set of demonstration data. So we will be summarizing that feedback and how it was incorporated into decision making. Exactly what the time frame on that is, I can't currently, but you can look for it.
Fantastic. Thanks so much.
And can I add one more thing? Sorry, a colleague just reminded me I'd forgotten about this. So in addition to the analyses that were already in the previous edition of the Right Iramata paper, a new version of that paper will be released very shortly. I think John was commenting on this in the chat, probably before Tuesday of next week. On top of that, we've also just recently received 67 new plans from the Department of Justice this week for additional evaluations, specifically for small areas and for other race and ethnicity categories, such as Asian individuals or American Indian Alaska Native individuals. So we also have additional analyses planned in the coming days based on those.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. That's a very, very important clarification. We appreciate it. So next up, we have Flo Gutierrez, and then she is followed by Gina Adams.
Hi. Good afternoon. Thank you for sharing all this information with us. We were wondering if you will be producing any reports or if you're going to be doing any research on the impact of DP on children. As Gina mentioned in her comment, research that Dr. William O'Hare just recently released shows that it really has huge impact, especially in areas with small populations. And he also found that it appears that the linkage between children and the parent or the householder is being broken, which is problematic on many levels. And we're just wondering, one, are you doing any research? And is it true that the linkage is being broken? And is there any way to make sure that that doesn't happen?
So thank you for that question, and it's one that we have been receiving feedback on, including from Dr. O'Hare himself. This is something that we have identified, and I think it's important to recognize the difference in the data products that are planned and the difference in the algorithms that are going to be supporting those. So the demonstration data that we just released are just for the redistricting data, which the only age component is voting age, non-voting age. We'll be doing additional tuning of the algorithms to support the expanded demographic and housing characteristics file, which would be the next data product in sequence. And that's when substantially more attention will be paid to the more finely tuned age categories and single year of age and the impact there. But I also want to highlight that one of the later data products in the sequence are the person household joins that really get at a family structure and specifically to the kinds of linkages that you're talking about. And those are being protected with a different algorithm that specifically will permit kind of keeping those family structures intact. So I think where you will get the best quality data on those types of statistics is going to be in those subsequent data products in what we used to call the Group 2 data, now the detailed demographic and housing characteristics files.
Okay, I'm showing next in the queue Gina Adams, and then we have Richard Chang, and Jerry will be calling back in, and so we should be able to join Jerry Green at the very end of the queue.
Jim, Flo kind of included my question in hers, which was great, so you can just get me. This is Gina. You can go on to Richard.
Okay, fantastic. Richard Chang, the floor is yours. And Richard, you may need to unmute.
Yes, hi. I heard that there was going to be additional analysis provided for some of the other racial and ethnic groups, and I was wondering if Native Hawaiians and other Pacific Islanders would be included. I didn't hear that group mentioned along with the others.
So the detailed summary metrics that we produce with every set of demonstration data look at all of the different racial groups. And my colleague Matt Spence, who's on the line, can talk more about what's included in those. But beyond that, if there are specific analyses that you would like, please let us know, and we can certainly consider them for production.
Okay, Jerry has indicated that she's still having technical difficulties, so I'm just gonna ask another quick question while we try to get her connected. Michael, with the 67 additional use studies, redistricting use studies you got from DOJ, what do you expect the time frame will be to review those? And will it be in time before you actually have to go before DSEP, which we understand, I think, is as soon as next Thursday?
It will be doing it quickly. That much I can say. We're burning the midnight oil on a lot of things right now, as you can imagine. Now we're gonna do our analyses on those as expeditiously as possible because yes, we want, when DSEP is making their decisions, we want them to have the best information in front of them in order to inform that decision making.
Fantastic, and we certainly understand and appreciate how much work you're doing on this. We really do appreciate it. Next up, we're going to have Dan Lichter. And Dan, you may need to unmute. Dan, just following up, are you, it looks like you have a question in the queue. I'll give you just a second to see if you can get in, and if not, maybe we can just read it and have it answered, but we'll give you just a second to get in. Not hearing you come in, so I'll just read it. Dan writes, at the recent ACS Data Users Conference, my understanding is that the Census Bureau described its plans to replace the ACS microdata with, quote, fully synthetic data. This may be off topic, but could we get the Census Bureau to clarify this discussion at some point, if not today? It seems there are widely disparate views about what this is and what it means for the academic user community.
Yes, so I can give a short answer on that and then a prompt for more information to come. The information that was presented at the ACS conference was about ongoing research No decisions to that effect have been made yet. As we previously stated about the modernization of disclosure avoidance for the ACS, that is going to be an ongoing process and one that we are going to engage extensively with our data users about before any of those decisions are made or implemented. We will also have a public statement relating to the presentation that was made last week that will be coming out shortly.
Okay, thanks so much. And Dan was experiencing some technical difficulties. Next up is Flo.
I'm just wondering what you all can say about to what extent which products that come after the redistricting data will be forced to be consistent with the data in the redistricting file.
So it's important in discussing consistency to recognize the different algorithms that are being used for the different sets of data products. So the top-down algorithm will be used for the redistricting file and for the demographic and housing characteristics file. And the algorithm is designed to enable full consistency of the demographic and housing characteristics file to the redistricting file. So that the algorithm is designed to be able to make those completely consistent. A separate set of algorithms are being developed for the subsequent data products, including the detailed DHC and the person household joins. And we're not in a position at the moment to be publicly discussing exactly what those algorithms are going to be producing, but we do intend to engage with the NAC on those subsequent data products in the near future.
Thank you.
Okay, I see next up we have a question from Gina Adams in the chat, but if you'd like to go ahead and say it live, that would be great.
Get myself off mute. Yes, this is actually not an idea of mine, but a colleague yesterday was asking whether there was an alternative that we might want to be considering whereby the actual data addressing these kinds of concerns could be provided to essential confidential entities like federal agencies, state governments, et cetera, to allow them to make some of these funding and distribution kinds of decisions so that we might be thinking differently about what we're releasing for kind of analysis for other purposes, but for things like funding allocations that are so essential. I thought it was an interesting idea. I was curious to your reaction.
Yes, thank you for that question. That's one that we get a lot. Unfortunately, there's kind of two factors at work there. The first is the legal one, and that's that all 2020 census data products have to go through the disclosure avoidance system before they can be released outside the Bureau. And Title 13 precludes us from sharing any Title 13 protected information with anyone without special sworn status. And that would include individuals at other federal agencies that are using the data for administrative purposes. But even from a more kind of practical standpoint, having worked with funding formulas in my own past, I know that much of those formulas, you can kind of reverse engineer the underlying numbers by knowing, through transparency rules, by knowing how much money is being allocated to a place. So even if the agency said they weren't going to release the actual totals, it would be, in many cases, quite easy to calculate back to what those population totals were. So there's kind of the practical considerations as well as the legal ones.
Okay, next up we have in the queue, Tom Sands has two additional questions.
Michael, you mentioned the goal of consistency between the PL data and the DHC. Could you just explain what's the consequence of inconsistency? Because I want to understand that to get my mind around why there has to be, why the Bureau is aiming for that consistency between the two. That's my first question. And my second question is, if it's possible to briefly explain to us, and this relates to the consistency between data sets, how decisions on the privacy loss budget, the algorithm being made today for the PL file and then the DHC will affect the ACS and the estimations that are put together later in the decade using the ACS sample. hope those questions are clear.
So I am actually going to defer to one or more of my colleagues from our demographic directorate to answer those questions because they are the experts on the actual uses of the data.
And Michael, I'm not sure. Are your colleagues on?
This is John Aboud. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So I just spoke up because I wanted to make sure you could hear me. Matt is in the same speaker's room that I'm in. You should be able to hear him too.
Yeah, Matt, are you there?
Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can.
This is Matt Spence. Hi, sorry about that. Must have been on mute. So research is currently underway to evaluate, how these, differential private, these top-down algorithm output will be used for the population estimates program going forward and survey controls that depend on the population estimates. There will be likely a transition period where sort of there might be some sort of a blending of various sources, but the intention is to get to a point where the data are accurate enough for the use cases necessary for the population estimates program in order to be able to use these data and rely on these data. So that is the goal. That is what we're shooting for, and research is currently underway and being undertaken to be able to produce those single years of age by sex, by GQ type at county levels and other levels needed for these population estimates.
I see that we're about 90 seconds away from the public comment period. It may be best at this point to stop. I'm going to read Jerry Green's questions right after the public comment, and I'll also just reiterate what Devera put in the chat. She's requested that all the NAC and Census Bureau speakers identify themselves by name when speaking. So with that,
Jim, this is Tom again. I appreciate that answer, which was to my second question, but if someone could still address why consistency between PL and DHC is given the high value that it is by the Bureau.
Hi, this is John Aboud. I notice that no one leapt right in, so I will rush in where angels fear to tread. The technical reason is that the systems that produce our public use products tabulate from microdata. And so if you tabulate from microdata, then all the tables are inherently, from a single microdata image, then all the tables are inherently consistent, both within and between tables and across layers. That's been the traditional dissemination format for virtually all tabular data products the Census Bureau puts out. At the moment, it is a policy decision to enforce that on the demographic and housing characteristics after the redistricting data product has been released. But it is not an immutable one, and so you should feel free to state your position on the pros and cons of consistency, but that goes to the entire advisory committee.
Okay. Thank you very much, John. Thank you, Tom. It is now 4 p.m., so we now have to take a break and have the public comment period. Before we open this forum to the public, I do want to give a few instructions. Attendees are in listen-only mode and are not able to speak. Comment submissions can be done via the email address on the NAC website or via the WebEx chat feature. Your submission should include your name, organization, and comment. Once submitted, I will verbally read your comment for all attendees, and the comment will be posted to the NAC website. So at this point, we'll wait a few minutes to see if we have public comments that come in.
Hi, Karen. It's Shauna Bank. Can you hear me?
Yes, Shauna.
Hi. I think what we can do is leave the chat feature open for public comment to continue. And if we'd like to go back to some of the questions we were engaged in, we will interrupt and come back to public comments if we receive some.
Okay.
So the feature will remain open if the public would like to continue with their comments, and we'll return before it closes to read those comments.
Okay. And so with that, I'll turn it back over to James Tucker to continue the committee discussion.
Okay, and I'm going to recognize Yoma. I believe you're going to read Jerry Green's question, which, again, we're sorry, Jerry, that you're having the technical issues. But please go ahead.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Hi, this is NAC member Yoma Ruka reading this on behalf of NAC member Jerry Green. So here's her question or her comment. What impact will the application of DP have on already undercounted populations? Populations affected heavily by the differential undercount, particularly Black men and young Black children. We are particularly concerned about the southern population, where as much as a third of the Black population resides, and we're hit hard by hurricanes, not well counted. So what role will recall bias play regarding DP application? What impact will DP have on the PES, which measures how well census counted all populations, especially racial and ethnic groups? And finally, how will the white overcount be impacted by DP? Will it increase? And I'll just continue just a couple more. I know these are not the most technical questions, but these are very practical issues we need to understand regarding pervasive and persistent undercounts of our populations and how data swapping and other forms of disclosure avoidance will impact our count, voting rights, and political representation overall, much less federal funding allocations.
Hi, this is Matt Spence from the Population Division at Census. To answer your question about sort of the overall effects of the top-down algorithm on race counts, we've been looking into that as part of our detailed summary metrics. And the statistic that we really lean on to look at sort of bias or directional impact is something that is called the MALPE, M-A-L-P-E. And what that is it's the mean algebraic percent error. It's a measure that lets us see, sort of on average, does a group tend to gain population or lose population? So, I'm looking at if you happen to have the detailed summary metrics, handy, or if you'd like to look them up later. I'm looking at Table 8. Table 8A is Hispanic or Latino origin by race alone for state populations. Table 8B is Hispanic or Latino origin by race alone for county. And you can look into the MALPE, the directional change for these groups, and see, just if if groups are tending to gain population or lose population. There's been a significant amount of improvement in these sorts of bias measurements, these sorts of metrics of bias. We're seeing a lot less of it in the most recent April PPMF. but we are still seeing some groups, sort of tend to gain and others tend to lose. Right now, I'm looking at the county level, and the non-Hispanic white alone has a negative number. It's negative 0.07. So, on average at the county level, the non-Hispanic white alone population is losing about 7/100ths of a percent. I am also seeing that there are some other numbers as well, as you mentioned, potentially the non-Hispanic Black alone population has a negative number of 1.9. So their population tends to lose 1.9% of the population. Other groups, like some other race and two or more races, tend to gain population. So, another way to formulate might be looking at the alone or in combination. So all that to say, these metrics are something that we've been looking into. We've been publishing data on them. We've been shooting to get to sort of an unbiased result where no group tends to gain or lose. And so we encourage, folks to continue to comment if they're seeing issues like that.
And Tom, I'm not sure if you had another question. Your hand was still raised.
Sorry, Jim, that was a mistake then.
Okay, I think we're actually through all of the questions. So I guess we'll just turn it back to you real quick, Karen. I don't know if you've gotten any public comments.
I do not see any public comments at this point in time. So if you are concluding the committee discussion, then you're welcome to move on to the discussion and formulation of NAC recommendations.
Okay, fantastic. And if you could just give me the share capability, I will share my screen with the draft recommendations. And I understand it'll take just a moment.
Yes, it'll take just a moment. Thank you, Jim.
Thanks a lot. Okay, got it. So let me make sure I'm getting the right thing. And so I want to make sure that everyone is on the same page literally with me. Let me go ahead and minimize. So everyone, what should be displayed right now is the draft recommendations. It says priority use cases. Can you see that? Okay. Not hearing.
Hey, this is Shauna Banks. I can see it, yes.
Okay, fantastic. We're not going to.
I know you were asking your committee, but I wanted you to know.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you. Thank you so much. We're not going to read through the preamble, although anyone, as we walk through this, if anyone wants to make any changes, please speak up. And it'll actually be easier for me just because I'm sharing screen if you just unmute and just say if you have any proposed edits or changes. And so we'll just walk through the ones that we have received coming into today, starting with number 1. And moving down to the recommendation. And in particular, I just want to make sure that we're not omitting any priority uses that are not on this list of 4, that if anyone has any to add, please speak up. Okay, not hearing any, we will move to number 2.
Jim, could you make it a little bit bigger? This is Gina.
Yeah. Yes. Is that better? I'll move back up.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so this is the recommendation number 1. And again, please, if there are any additional priority uses that you think we need to add to this list, please speak up. Not hearing any, we will go down to number 2. I think I may actually be able to make it just a little bit bigger. Let me see if I can go up to about 140%.
This is John About. The best option is usually view page width.
Okay, and I think we're there now. So thank you so much. I think we're there. I think this is the maximum we can do. So number 2. Again, the preamble mainly just talking about the number of small places in the United States. And I'll show the example, and then we can move to the recommendation. Okay, moving down to the recommendation. And again, please just speak up. You don't have to raise your hand. You don't have to put it in chat. It's easier for me with the share screen if you just speak up. Okay, not hearing any, we will move to number 3. And again, I also want to remind folks that if you have any additional recommendations beyond what have already been sent in, actually at this point, the easiest way to do it may just be to send them by email, and we can add them in at the very end. And so recommendation number 3. And again, any proposed changes, edits, any concerns, any discussion about this. Recommendation number 4. And again, number 4 is talking about possible variances that may exist because of the different between the actual and adjusted counts for small political boundaries that may be participating in the voting district program. Does anyone have any questions, concerns, comments, amendments? Okay, not hearing any, we'll move to number 5. And again, I won't read through the intro, but you can certainly see it. Now let me go down a little bit for the recommendation. So again, the takeaway is mainly a request that there be considered the level of variance between the actual and adjusted counts for all minority groups in less populated places and not just the largest minority group. Any questions, concerns? Okay. We'll go to number 6. And this is just a request for continued consultation. So not hearing anything. Again, please speak up. And then number 7. And that's just a request for more concrete measurements for the loss of privacy associated with adjustments to the epsilon. So any questions, concerns, amendments? Okay, we'll go to number 8. And I will say that I think these next ones are fairly similar to some that the CSAC had made 2 days ago. And again, it's requesting regular communications and updates. Not hearing any. Number 9. Again, requesting continued transparency. Not hearing any. The next is number 10. Regarding factors that DCEP has used for consideration of the privacy loss budget. I'm not hearing any. Number 11. And again, this is just looking for more public documentation for data users that basically is similar to what's already released for the ACS. Not hearing any. I'm going to turn it over at this point to those who proposed number 12. And if one of you, I know 3 of you proposed it, but again, focusing primarily on the recommendation, if you want to just explain what the recommendation covers. And I think this came from either Flo or Gina.
Flo, do you want to do this? You want to take this on? Okay, I'm not hearing from Flo. This is Gina. I'll just go through this. Let me just go back. So we're looking at, I'm sorry, can you go back up? Flo put these together, so I'm just trying to remember where we are with it.
Sure, yeah, and I think this was actually, you had several recommendations in one.
Yeah, I'm just remembering myself. Remember what's going on here. Okay, okay, you can go back down, thanks. This is basically just trying to get at the issue that percentage-wise, the errors that Flo was talking about a little bit earlier in terms of children, counting children, and that the errors are higher for Black, Hispanic, and Asian children, and that we would like to have the Bureau consider differential privacy metrics for kids so that we can be really understanding how the differential privacy issues affect data quality and accuracy for that population.
And if anyone else has any questions or comments, please feel free to speak up before we move to the next one. Number 13.
The next one was that there are some specific targets that the Bureau has for other purposes, and we were actually wanting to have a specific accuracy target for differential privacy in children. This is an issue that we thought might be something that the rest of the NAC might be interested in considering similar language for other populations. But in this case, you guys can read it. Basically, it says for all geographic units larger than census blocks for which data are reported, after that has been subjected to DP, the results for children should be within 5% of the true value 95% of the time, and no error should be more than 10%. This we felt like was an important goal, and like to recommend that that be an accuracy target.
Any comments or questions for Flo? Or for Gina, I'm sorry? Okay, number 14.
Similarly, we'd like to have a specific accuracy target for differential privacy in children of color, Black, Hispanic, Asian, and Native, and American Indian and Alaska Native.
Okay, any questions, concerns, comments? We'll go to number 15.
And then this one goes back to the issue that Flo was talking about earlier, which is the concern that the current approach seems to be unlinking children from their parents. And we want to make sure that the Bureau implements differential privacy in a way that does not break the link between children and adults in a household.
And then turning to, these were some specific recommendations that had come in from the National Congress of American Indians. And again, because there are a few of us who represent the AIAN community, I basically modified them. Again, recognize that NCAI's important contribution to these recommendations. So the first one, again, is recommending the accuracy and usability of the tribal geography data, that it be improved significantly with any reductions in accuracy, being unacceptable. And I think the concern, again, is that certainly some of the analysis that I know both NCAI and the Native American Rights Fund have done have shown that there are some fairly big variations in very, very small places. We do want to commend the Bureau for doing a much better job of getting the numbers, much closer to what they actually are within tribal areas and reservations, but we are still seeing, enough variation that it gives us concerns. So I don't know if anyone has any questions or concerns. Okay, I'm going to go back. Richard, please. We're going to go back to number 14. And so you have a friendly amendment. You have Native, Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander. I know I'm going to misspell it. I knew I was going to misspell it. Richard, I'll just put, I'm going to do this just for right now, but we will spell it out afterwards. You're putting me to the test, Richard. Thank you. So going to number 17. Again, it would propose that we recommend that the Census Bureau ensure that the total population count in each tribal geography be held invariant, equal to the actual count, and that errors and other decennial demographic and housing characteristics be no more than 5%, regardless of the size of geography. It's somewhat similar to what Gina had just mentioned. I think that Gina had mentioned a slightly greater level of acceptable variance, but I think that this is particularly true of what we would like to see with the tribal geography, given that, and again, we thank the Bureau for improving substantially what it's doing with tribal geography, but we're still seeing a fairly high level of variance. So I don't know if there are any questions or concerns. We will go to number 10. And again, this just suggests...
Jen?
Yes, please. Who is this?
It's Teku Lee. I couldn't figure out how to unmute myself, but can you just give a little background on where the 5% error rate figure comes from? And there's the earlier recommendation 13 also, which bounded it from 5 to 10%. Are these numbers based on some previous research, or I just want to know why 5 as opposed to 3 or 7?
Oh, no, it's a great question. And I think if Michael Hawes is still on, I think it's probably a question for either Michael or Matt, because it somewhat tracks what the Census Bureau was doing in populations that I believe the cutoff was either 500 or 550 that you were talking about. It had to be within 5%, 95% of the time, or something like that. I'm probably misstating it. But I don't know if Michael or Matt, if you're on the line.
This is Michael Hawes.
Oh, go ahead, Michael.
I'm just getting my video started again. So I think that was tracking the tuning of the algorithm that we were doing as part of the parameter setting for the April demonstration data. And that tuning, we were looking at a large number of metrics, and Matt Spence can talk more about the many different measures that we were looking at. But specific to the redistricting use case, the metric that we were targeting for off-spine geographies, minor civil divisions in strong MCD states, and places, both incorporated places and census-designated places in weak MCD states. The specific metric we were tuning to for the redistricting use case was that the proportion of the largest racial group within any of those geographies as a share of the total population for that geography, for geographies with between 500 and 549 people, was to be within 5 percentage points of the enumerated value at least 95% of the time. And so that was what we were doing, that primary tuning of the parameters to when setting the kind of the initial expected level of privacy loss budget for the April demonstration data. As I said, it was only one of the many measures we were looking at, but it was one we were specifically tuning to. And so I'm assuming that those percentages were selected to track with what we had set as our tuning targets.
Thank you.
Yes, that's largely what was being done, I think, by both groups. So I'm going to go ahead and reshare. Thank you so much for that clarification, too. Just bear with me for 1 second. Okay. And Tom, I am adding in your recommendation. That's what you see pulled up, but I'm going to go back to the other ones, and then we will go to the 3 additional ones that you have to add. And so let's just see. Okay, so we just did number 17. So number 18. And this basically recommends that the Census Bureau follow its standard practice of suppressing counts under 10 if there's a risk to privacy, but this be done in consultation with tribal nations and other affected groups. And the reason is that if there is any suppression, there may be other uses that there may be a reason why that data is needed outside of redistricting, and we just want to make sure that that would be available. And I don't know if I know that in the presentation, and I don't know, Michael, if you're the appropriate person to ask about this, but the presentation had also mentioned that it may go as high as 14, but our understanding at least was that it's currently 10 for suppression.
The distinction there is between, and Rolando can also chime in on this, the distinction is between cell suppression and table suppression. So I believe the 14 was the implementation of the 1980 rule for tables. The 1 or 2 was the implementation rule in 1980 for individual cells. Rolando, do you want to add?
No, that's correct. And I'm assuming that this 10 is referring us to specific cells. I haven't seen this number before. But if it's tables, then it would be related to the 14. But if it's cells, it's 1 or 2, which is kind of the lowest you want to go with cell suppression.
Okay, yeah, and that's my understanding as well. See, going down to number 19. And this is basically just to ensure, and by the way, I want to open it up that if anyone else wants to join this, because I think it's probably broader than the AIAN population. But again, the concern is that we not be in a position where there's an actual count that ends up in 0. So that essentially you could have population zeroed out. And the concern that was coming from NCI was specifically focusing on the fact that some very, very small communities, in some instances, at least in some iterations of the PPMFs, had actually shown that the count was zeroed out, and that was a concern. So I don't know if I want to open it up and just see if anyone else would like to make a friendly amendment to this to possibly expand it to include other groups as well. I mean, I could just add the words in other racial and ethnic population groups.
This is Gina. I was going to suggest that. I think that'd be great.
I'll do it even in order, other ethnic and racial population groups. And then we'll go ahead and move this outside of just being a Native American recommendation. I'm just going to make a note. I'm going to put it in yellow highlights so we know that we need to move it. So we'll make it a more general recommendation. So number 20. This basically is just a request for more open disclosure, for more transparency to ensure that there is accurate and useful data. And again, I'm going to suggest that we should probably make this beyond the tribal nations and make the same amendment if others agree.
Yes.
And again, I'll do the same thing. Just we need to move it into general. And again, 21 may be the same thing. I mean, I think that the broader recommendation was in just trying to increase the global privacy loss budget, and that's what the recommendation really refers to. And I don't know if anyone, and I know Tom, I know MULDEP has done some work on this. I don't know if you wanted to comment specifically if there's a specific recommendation on what you think the epsilon should be set at, or if anyone else has any specific recommendations on what the privacy loss budget should actually be set at.
I don't have a recommendation, Jim. I would say that I would word the recommendation, say joins NCAI and others, because I think there are others and will be more who recommend that the privacy loss budget be increased for the redistricting fund.
Okay, but you don't have a specific epsilon, just that it should be.
I do not. Yeah.
Okay. And we'll actually change that to be other organizations. I'll go back.
Gina, I'm actually wondering, 20 seems to me to be broader, and I'm actually wondering whether Flo and Ioma or Charlie have any thoughts about adding in children to number 20, because all of our groups are trying to get accurate counts, and it seems like it's a pretty broad request. Am I right in reading this quickly that
Yeah, I agree with that.
And I just want to make sure the language is okay. And groups working with children, or do you want me to say young children?
No, I think children's fine.
I think it's probably broader than young children.
Yeah, I think that's good. Thank you.
We will move all of those up and make them more generic, more general recommendations. And then this is really more of a race and ethnicity recommendation. And again, what 22 is referring to is that largely because of where populations are located, that it seems like there tends to be a greater and more disparate impact on communities of color. And so this is really just recommending that, that there not be any racial or ethnic disparities in terms of how the data comes out because of the application of differential privacy. And so, Tom, I suspect you probably want me to add in the same language. And so other organizations. And I want to open it up and see if anyone has any amendments or changes to that. Okay, not hearing any, we'll go to 23. And again, I think 23 also lends itself to probably being more uniform. This is talking about tribal consultations, but we can also make it much broader to have, public meetings or meetings with stakeholders. So I just want to open it up to see if anyone has any friendly amendments to that or any other discussion.
I think this could be made more broad as you did in the other. This is Gina. As you did both with other groups, racial and ethnic groups, and about kids. Because, Mike, we want to understand all of those issues.
Okay, well, that works. So it would read, the NAC joins NCA and other organizations, because I think that is also an accurate statement. In recommending that the Census Bureau conduct additional public meetings and tribal consultations to obtain feedback. I think that's fine, from tribal nations and stakeholders from other ethnic and racial groups and groups working with children about the decisions made by DCEP and its implications, with information to be communicated in an accessible format for individuals who may lack an understanding. And the last part of this is really referring to the fact that we really do applaud how transparent and open the communications have been, but we also have received some feedback suggesting that some people are having a very, very difficult time understanding exactly what differential privacy is and what its implications are. So with that.
Can I suggest groups working on behalf of children? I think groups working with children sounds like direct service providers to me. Thanks.
Done. And let me just go ahead and make the same global edit.
So number 20 to end it. Yeah, you got it.
Okay, and with that, Tom, I saw you just put another one in the chat. Let me do a stop share.
I put 3 and I numbered them, Jim, 1, 2, 3.
Okay, bear with me for just 1 second, and I will copy them all in. And then, Jerry, I also see yours, and I see some additional ones. Actually, it may be easiest for me. Let me just go ahead and copy from here down. Bear with me for 1 second. And I'm going to copy all of this in. And we'll reformat. And Flo, I see the request for information. I'm going to make a note of that. We're actually going to do that separately. We'll probably do it right after I don't know if we'll probably end up having to do it via email because we have several also that we'll have to reformat from last time. And there's a question while we're doing this, and it looks like that's from Flo. And the question is, Bill O'Hare's research shows over 90,000 blocks with children but no adults. Why is this? If the methods used to the redistricting file are going to be used in the housing and characteristic file, what will it mean for data and linkages in the DHC file? And so I don't know if we have someone on who can answer that.
So this is Michael Hawes again. I can certainly answer part of that question, and I will open it to my colleagues to further answer. So the issue there is it's particularly an issue in small blocks where you have just a small number of individuals. And with the injection of noise, you do get some change in characteristics of voting age or not voting age. It is something that we're looking at, and we're looking to make further adjustments to the algorithm to minimize. But in terms of the impact on subsequent data products, that ties in with the discussion that we had earlier about consistency between the PL and the demographic and housing characteristics file. If that consistency is maintained, then the disaggregation of non-voting age individuals in the PL file into single years of age will carry through. If that consistency is relaxed, then that may not carry through. But I do want to stress again that the household structure and the linkage of parents with children and the composition of households are data that are going to be included in substantial detail using a different set of algorithms for the detailed demographic and housing characteristics files, which will be coming out later. And those are not subject to the same constraints that the top-down algorithm is. And so you can expect those data to be able to much better maintain that household structure.
Okay, does that fully answer your question, Flo, or was there another part that needed to be answered? If not, I can actually jump back. And I've got Tom and, I hate to say it, Tom and Jerry's recommendations are now in the documents. Not hearing any, I'm going to go ahead and share again. And you should see, going to recommendation number 24, and this comes from Tom.
And this just addresses the issue of the consistency between the two that Michael just mentioned again.
Okay, so does anyone have any questions for Tom or any amendments or revisions? Okay, not hearing any. Tom, number 25.
I think that's just a repeat of 24. I think you may have copied that one twice, I guess.
Yeah, sorry about that. Let me go ahead and get rid of it.
Okay, so the new 25 is just trying to ensure that we get a public, just to help with the rollout of the very, very specific data and looking at across different characteristics of the electoral districts that the Bureau has evaluated and analyzed during the course of developing the DP that's to be used on the PL file.
Anyone have any questions or concerns about 25? Okay, Tom, 26. And
26 is just, I had raised a question, and then we were told, of course, that there were distortions introduced to the previous staff in 2010. I don't know that the Bureau has shared enough of that so that you can make a comparison. So through previous staff, there were changes that had voting rights implications, certainly, potentially at least, of the swapping that occurred. But I don't think we've gotten enough data publicly about that to compare it fairly to what the effects of DP might be. So that's what that's about.
Any questions for Tom on number 26? Okay, number 27 is Jerry. I don't know if you've been able to get on, Jerry.
I think she's on the call. This is Ioma. I think she's on the call with a contractor, so I'm not sure she's able to still get on yet.
At 4:33, she said she's unable to participate in the call, so please add this recommendation.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. And I think the main thing is just going to be to update it because she has references to the National Urban League, and we need to make this from the NAC. So let me go ahead and do that. And and really the first part of it seemed to be more of an intro background. So just bear with me for 1 second. I'm doing this in real time.
Jim, you do this amazingly well. I just want to say thank you. This is not an easy task. So this is
thank you, although
well
I have to say that, yes, it's always a dangerous proposition because you can see all my mistakes, too, in real time.
No, that's why I can say you're doing it well.
So, Jim, I'm wondering, this is Ioma, part of at least what Jerry had there is a recommend. So is that recommendation that says the NAC recommends that the final DP algorithm, et cetera, is that reflected in that recommendation right below?
Yeah, so let me do that.
Yeah. Okay.
So I think that's right. I think they're really two separate recommendations.
Yeah.
Thank you for pointing that out. Okay, so looking at it now, the overview is the NAC is particularly concerned that Southern Black population, where as much as 1/3, we should probably put this in parens, where as much as 1/3 of the Black population resides, and were hard hit by hurricanes. And were hard hit by hurricanes and not well counted, will be adversely impacted by differential privacy application and increased disclosure avoidance measures. The privacy loss budget should not reflect or translate into a loss of constitutional rights, including voting, one person, one vote. The first recommendation is the NAC recommends that the Census Bureau consider impacts the application of differential privacy will have on already undercounted populations affected heavily by the differential undercount, i.e. Black men and young Black children. And I just want to suggest, I don't know if anyone has any amendments to this or if we want to keep it just focused on the Black population. Okay. And then yeah, go ahead.
I mean, for me, it's not just young Black children. Latinos had a much higher undercount than young Black children. So
So I just want to confirm this is Flo Gutierrez.
Yes, sorry.
You prefer Hispanic or Latinos?
I think Hispanic is more inclusive.
Probably true. I don't know if anyone else. Populations. So Richard, I suspect you're probably going to want me to add in NHPI. Okay. So any questions or concerns about that or further amendments? Okay. Yes, I saw it pop up, Richard, so we're good to go. And then number 28, the NAC recommends the final differential privacy algorithm and data privacy loss budget for the Black population not exceed that of other race and ethnic groups and have no impact. I think the only thing I would just say about 28 is that it overlaps with one that we did earlier, and I think the other one was probably more inclusive because it talked about not having it exceed non-Hispanic whites.
I think that's stronger because we have bad undercounts for other racial ethnic groups too. So I think we don't want to set the bar so low.
Jerry, if you could just confirm in the chat that you're okay if we just simply treat that as being already covered by number 22.
I'm not sure Jerry can hear the call.
Oh, okay.
He might be. I'm just not sure from the back and forth.
And I will add in National Urban League since she also made that recommendation. But if no one has any, if there are no objections, I'm just going to delete number 28. Okay, not hearing any. And with that, we've gone through and we've edited all of these. We'll do the holdovers in just a moment. I just want to mention, and Tony, and I'm sure Karen can confirm this, we're under a very, very tight time frame for getting our recommendations in. So per my conversation with Tony, when we finalize the recommendations today, we literally are going to be finalizing them. They will be sent to Tony. They may have some typos. They may not be the prettiest recommendations in the world, but given the fact that public comments on differential privacy close out tomorrow, we don't want to hold it up just because we're trying to make it look prettier. With that, I'm going to go back to the Word documents, and I'm going to shift gears, and we are going to go to the right one, holdover recommendations. And so I'll just say we're going to start off. There were 3 that we had just minor tweaks. One of them, John Sandoval, I received it, and I already incorporated it into number 70. So I guess we wanted to start off with number 60. I know there were some questions about number 60 from the holdover recommendations on whether or not that was an accurate statement. And just see if anyone can be the champion for number 60, if anyone wants to speak up, or whether folks feel like we should just continue to hold it over. Yeah, hearing any.
Correctly, yes, that we decided to take this one off. I thought I remembered Tom saying that it didn't hold in the comments last time.
Okay. And just to confirm, this is Flo Gutierrez. I'm just going to ask folks to identify themselves when they speak.
Sorry.
No, that's okay.
So, Jim, it's Tom. I did not get a chance to check with Julie. I think this all originated with a message from Julie, if you recall. But I don't know if you had this chance. I didn't.
No, and that's why I think rather than deleting it, we'll just continue to hold it over because it's just unclear, and I don't think we want to make a recommendation until we're completely clear. So if there are no objections, we'll hold over number 60. Okay, number 65, I cannot remember. I don't know if this was Teku. I can't remember. I know number 70 was Teku, and I think John.
Number 65 was me. This is
okay.
Carol.
Yes.
So this was essentially requesting to add an item to that battery of the item response.
And I know there were some questions about this last time. I think, Carol, I don't think you were in the small group when we discussed it, but I wanted to see if anyone has any, particular concerns that they think that there are any ambiguities in what the recommendation is.
Yeah, this is Flo. I just had a comment on the question because right now it sort of aggregates all the data together. So it's work. So if we add these two, it would just be 2 things that are added to and the list of other things that are there. So I was suggesting that we add those 2 things, but then we request that the Bureau just aggregate the data by the type so we could see the differences in each of the, because I think it's associate's degree, it's bachelor's degree, it's, I can't remember the question, but that was what I was saying, but we don't need to do that.
So Flo, did you have a specific amendment that you want to make to number 65?
Well, I would leave it up to the person who made the recommendation if they want to make the edit or put it as is.
So, Flo, is your suggestion to how to aggregate the data? That's not clear.
Well, my understanding. Oh, go ahead.
What?
I'm sorry. I think Tom, you had a suggestion.
Oh no, this is Teiku. I was just wondering if the recommendation was to split this up into two questions that we're recommending. One on inability to take part in work experience or internships, and then semicolon a separate one on obtaining a certificate during the pandemic, so that we can then disaggregate the effects of each of those.
Yeah.
But then that would be three questions, right? There's the existing one on training, education.
I think it would be fine to limit it to inability to take part in work experience or internship, because that has implications for whether or not one could complete either a certificate or a degree program. And due to pandemic-related closures, it helps understand why that might not have occurred.
And so, Carol, are you okay with splitting out the second one, or do you want the second one that I just added deleted? The second one pertains to inability to obtain a certificate.
Yes, so they're fine as is. Thank you.
Okay, and I think I actually have to put this in.
Jim?
I deleted a little too much. Yes. And please identify who you are. Thank you.
Hi, Jim. This is Jerry Green. I'm finally able to get in. I can hear now, but I can't see you guys. But I just wanted you to know I can hear.
Okay, fantastic. And I wanted to let you know that we made the consensus was that the last recommendation you made was already encompassed in a recommendation, and it was actually a broader recommendation that would specifically say that the difference between the actual count and the adjusted count for communities of color should not be any worse than non-Hispanic white population.
Okay, good. All right, that does. I agree. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much.
Mm-hmm.
So if 65 is okay, and we'll figure out the numbering later. But if 65 looks good, we'll move to number 70. And I understand, John, you and Teiku had made an amendment to that is now showing up.
Correct.
Okay, and John Sandoval, I don't know if you have any questions or comments. Okay, not hearing any. Does anyone else have any questions or comments about number 70? Okay, next, we're going to go to, there were roughly about 10 recommendations under the community resilience estimates. And I think, InterD, you were working with Charles and Cherokee on these. So number 75. And I don't know if we have any of the three of you on, either InterD, Charles Broner, or Cherokee. Are you on? I just want to make sure, because I think the issue with these wasn't the content. I think some of them were just a little ambiguous, and I think that's what. And by the way, I guess the other thing I should mention is that you did. Let me go ahead and stop share. There actually is an updated version of this. I've already opened up. John's. Bear with me for 1 second. Okay, so, and I think, Charles, I think you worked with Interdeep on this, and I just want to walk through. Charles, you first had one for recommendation 78. Charles, are you on? And if you are, you may be muted. Interdeep or Cherokee, are you on? Okay, well, I'll just walk through these, and just if anyone thinks there are any ambiguities or there are questions or concerns, we may have to hold over some of these, but we'll just start with, we won't go through the lengthy preamble, but starting with 78A. So any questions, concerns, amendments, changes, or is 78A okay as is? You're not hearing any 78B? Again, I'm not hearing anything on 78C. Not hearing any 78D. And it's not really clear, I guess I'm not really clear on what 78D is asking about. Okay.
I don't understand that one either. This is Gina. I don't understand exactly what.
So this is Yoma. So the way I read that is that to look at sort of those indicators, those socio-demographic factors, right? Look at them, but not necessarily include them as an indicator, right? So for example, like people tend to use, percent of Black, so and so in that. So don't use them as one of your indicators. So I think that's how I read that particular one.
But I got confused because it's not, it's kind of like how people use, does the Census Bureau use it as an indicator, or are people using it as an indicator? That's what I was trying to figure out. That seems to me like a use factor that the Bureau doesn't really control.
And that's why I'm just going to suggest, because I think they're a little ambiguous. I'm still not really clear what it is that they're all suggesting. And I would recommend that we just, especially because we don't have any of the people who drafted them on the call, it makes it difficult. To
get what they meant for it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So 78E.
Should we just hold off on 78 until our next meeting? Is there anything that makes this pressing to be dealing with right now?
Oh, and just to identify yourself?
I'm sorry, this is Gina. I apologize.
No, that's okay. No, I think I agree with that, Gina, unless anyone disagrees. Because I think, again, they probably still need some work, and because we don't have any of the authors of it on, it makes it very difficult to do. And so we'll just go to number 75. It looks like 75 duplicates some of what's in 78. And I want to find out if anyone disagrees. I think part of the problem that we're struggling with the community resilience estimates, and it makes it difficult because none of the people who authored the recommendations are on call.
I think Charles Bruner is on now. I think I see him waving his hands up there.
Oh, okay. And Interdeep just put something in chat, and apparently they've got audio issues. I guess I think part of the concern is that some of these still need some wordsmithing, and I just don't know if we're going to have time to go through all of them. Because some of them are still unclear.
This is Gina. Charles says he's on, but he's muted.
Oh, Charles, can you unmute? Oh, okay. So Charles, apparently he's having technical issues. He can't. And then Interdeep has suggested that perhaps they will try to do this separately. And I will just remind folks that as strange as it sounds, I think we're going to have one more special NAC meeting over the summer. Correct me if I'm wrong, Karen, but I think we're talking about having a very short special meeting. So Charles is saying he would like to move these forward. I think the problem is that they still have some refinement, and we're not having the ability to discuss them with you and walk through. I think that's the problem. I don't think we can, unless someone disagrees, I don't know that we can, adopt these recommendations when I think there are still some questions about them.
Can the operator unmute him? Is he unmuted on this end or the operator's end?
Yeah, Charles, you may want to just try calling in. I think some people had the same issue initially, so try dropping off the call in and calling in using the special number that Tony provided.
Charles, this is Shauna Banks. I just sent you a direct chat with that telephone number. Can you give me a thumbs up if you dialed something different?
And then the only other thing I'll just mention is that the remaining ones for young children, there were no issues with, we can look at them again very quickly, but there were no issues with respect to these recommendations being unclear. So I think we were prepared to cover these when we go back to the formal session. It was just simply we just didn't have enough time 2.5 weeks ago to go through them. And as you can see,
sorry, James, it's Shauna Banks. Charles Bruner said he is calling in again.
Okay. So we'll hold that over. I'll leave this up for a moment and allow folks to look at the other ones. But again, we didn't really I don't think there were any questions or concerns about these. And I think most of these were actually offered by Charles. I don't think there were any issues or concerns. We just didn't have time to consider them. I'm going to stop share. We'll see if Charles can rejoin us. But it actually looks like we're surprisingly ahead of schedule. Charles, I can see you. Are you able to speak? It doesn't look like it.
Charles, this is Shauna Banks. Can you hit *0 on your phone?
And while we're working out that technical issue, I know Charles is still working on it. I just wanted to ask, I guess it's a question for Karen. It looks like even if we're able to resolve some of the issues with Charles and finalize those, we are going to have some time. And I take it because it's on the agenda at 5:20 Eastern, that should that occur, we would just simply take a break until 5:20?
Well, I will ask Shauna if we think we're going to be ready a bit earlier. I don't know if there's anything to stop us from presenting recommendations earlier, or if you do want to take a short break and leave the time frame at 5:20, I think that's fine.
Hi, James and Karen. This is Shauna Banks. Yes, you do have the option to begin your formal recommendations early if you like, but we are flexible with what you prefer.
Mm-hmm.
So what I would suggest, just because since I know we also have people who are watching this, that what probably makes the most sense is for us to walk through the recommendations that are ready. We can see in the interim if Charles can get on, if we're able to, circle back to some of those holdover recommendations and finalize them. But certainly I think the one thing that we can and should plan on doing is probably address all the differential privacy ones now. And unless there's any disagreement with that, I just wanted to make sure there was no issue in terms of backup because of the
James, so James, this is Sean. I do have a concern if you flip between deliberation and presenting recommendations. So I would like us to present when you're ready to begin, but it's after your deliberations conclude. So if you're hoping to still engage Charles and his feedback, I'd like us to continue to try to do that.
Okay, so we'll give Charles just a couple more minutes. Again, I know we've got a lot of people on hold. And, again, if we're not able to address it in the next few minutes, I think we're going to have to move forward with the recommendations that we have.
So Charles, this is Shauna Banks. If you could hit *0 on your phone, then we can try to have the operator assist you. Mr. Berner, it seems the operator is trying to reach you, but she's not getting a response from you. Are you muted?
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you, sir. This is Shauna Banks. Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, fantastic. So we have about 12 minutes to see if we can go through and finalize the other recommendations. So let me go back. And let me get in the right document. Okay, so we're going to start with number 78. And I just wanted to open it up. First of all, if anyone thinks that there are particular issues, we'll start with 78A.
This is Gina. I'm wondering, are we asking them to compare on 78A, compare for what, accuracy, or for what's the I'm not quite sure.
Well, there are a number of different indices that have been developed using the U.S. Census data that have tried to assess for risk or vulnerability or opportunity. And they go to the same relative database, but really asking for them to do some level of a crosswalk and looking for what they have and being able to compare with others. This is actually a very narrow indicator and doesn't really get to my mind, much in the way of issues of resiliency. But I think it would be good to really, in the second iteration, to develop one drawing upon data diversity kids, drawing upon different other opportunity indexes by other people, looking at the hard to count index, the way it was generated, and looking at the SVI.
And so I just want to clarify, because you had up there CVE. I think it's probably is easier to understand if we do CRE, Community Resilience Estimate.
Yeah, it's CRE. Should be there.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm just going to replace them. There were a few places that it's...
Yeah, there was I thought I'd replace them.
So any other questions for Charles or concerns about number 78A? 78B, any questions or concerns for Charles about 78B? Not hearing any. I don't think there were any with the next few. I think that the one that there were, 78D was the one I think that there were some questions about. So maybe if you could explain what you were proposing with 78D.
Yeah, well, and this is going also back to other indices that have been developed. When you calculate an index and you decide that it's a vulnerability or an opportunity index, the race or ethnicity or the foreign language status or the immigration status, and all those are sometimes used, are not really risk factors that or vulnerability factors. They're contextual factors, and that it's not because it's really, you should be looking at data like poverty, education, housing, and other types of adequacy, and then looking at them in the context of these populations. That's the way others do it, because I don't think, certainly discrimination is a risk factor, but that's not in and of itself a risk factor.
So I guess part of my question was I wasn't sure when you're saying, but not as factors used to assess risk per se. Risk per se in what?
Well, I think that you have to have that data and information, but we're not necessarily trying to change that data or information. We're trying to change issues around poverty, around housing, around education, around the other types of factors that go into this and go into the individual vulnerability.
So you're asking those variables, this is Gina, you're asking us not use those variables in the CRE index. Is that what?
Construction itself, yeah. In the construction of the index itself, in terms of they should be included as information and looking at the index that is constructed.
Charles, this is Tom. I totally understand what you're saying with respect to age, race, ethnicity, but in fact, the language can be a risk factor, and it is changeable, not often, and also influenceable by public policy decisions. So that if you make sure that English language education is broadly available to adults, you can change that. And similarly, citizenship is manipulable by policy, and I think that citizenship, again, not an expert in this area, but could in fact be a risk factor or lack of citizenship. So I totally hear you on things that are unchangeable, age, race, ethnicity. I'm just not clear on why language and citizenship are necessarily in the same category.
I'm happy to have those two deleted from this. And if we want to have a longer discussion later or other things, it's not essential to changing, but I do think that just deleting those would make sense.
And so with that modification, Tom, does that address your concern?
Yes.
I think, this is Gina, I think I would specifically say not as factors used on the index of the CRE. Something like that.
Someone else needs to mute. Please, if you're not speaking.
Taking this training, and what is protected by Title 26. Check your progress.
Someone has a video on. Please mute. And so, Gina, can you repeat that? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was just thinking we need to be a little bit more specific in this last clause, saying not as factors used in the CRE index. Because I think it's just factors to use. I wasn't sure who was assessing risk under what context.
Yeah, and I think that was the same question that I had, so I think that makes sense. Does that edit make sense to you, and is that agreeable, Charles?
Yeah.
Okay, any other questions or concerns about 78D? If you're not hearing any, we will move to 78E. We have 5 minutes left. Let's see if we can do this. I mean, one of the friendly amendment I would recommend, Charles, is that we do this. Because this really, you've got an explanation, and then I would make the recommendation at the end. Is that acceptable?
That's fine.
Okay. Any other questions, concerns, or comments about 78E? Not hearing any. Oops. Okay. 77. And 77 just seemed a little fragmented. It wasn't really clear what it meant.
EOMA, I think this is Gina. I think this was EOMA, that it was trying to think of, if it's a resilient measure, then it's mostly negative risks rather than positive risks.
I thought,
right?
Sorry. Thanks, Gina. This is EOMA. Yeah, I was trying to get there, but I thought some of it was already embedded in other ones. It was really, I didn't even finish this one. So I thought it was somewhere else. So I think you could take this out, but I thought there was another one that was in red that kind of had more of that full robustness.
Okay, so that is removed, and we'll go to, I don't know if this is 78. We'll have to look at the numbering. The numbering may be a little bit off.
That 78 can be deleted. That was, I replaced that.
Okay, just to confirm, this is Charles.
Yeah, it's Charles.
Any questions about 79?
You may want to change social capital with an O to an A at minimum.
I'm sorry, can you identify who's speaking?
Sorry, this is EOMA. I'm sorry, this is EOMA. It says social capital. I think is that with an A as opposed to an O.
This is Gina, EOMA. I'm just wondering whether you should just make sure that one of these red ones have the resilience factors. It might be.
Yeah, that is number 80. I think it was 80 that was coming up. Yeah.
82 maybe?
I was looking at 80. Just,
oh, gotcha. Okay, good. You're good.
Okay. So is that okay as is then with that edit on 79?
Yes.
Okay. Number 80. Any questions, concerns, comments? This just seems to be a comment. It doesn't really seem to be a recommendation.
I think it's in red because it was recommended as maybe being deleted, and I did try to include a lot of this in the recommendation 78 or those recommendations. Certainly agree with the sense. This is Charlie.
Oh, sorry. So this is EOMA. So I didn't know who wrote this one, but this one I thought fit what I was saying. So Charlie, that one is in yours. If this statement is in yours, then we can take it out. But I think this could be a recommendation by saying that the CRE framework should include these protective promotive factors, et cetera.
So why don't
the NAC
did you have a change then that you wanted to put it in the NAC recommends?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. The NAC,
So the NAC recommends what?
That the CRI framework pulls in some protective promotive factors. So go to the bottom. So pulls in some protective promotive factors such as access to resources, et cetera. So that last part.
Yeah, to me it's strange to call something a resilience factor and all the components that you're looking at are risk factors.
And I'm sorry, who was that?
Sorry, it's Flo.
Okay, so will this work?
So can you just write, this is EOMA, so the NAC recommends that the CRI framework includes, remove a way to pull in, so just remove that, so includes, and also delete some, includes, we should just, thank you. Thank you.
And can I just delete the rest, the balance of this?
Yeah.
Okay. So number 81, and we're actually right at 520, but we only have 2 left. So let's see if we can get through these. So any issues with 81?
This is Gina. I don't understand what we're asking them to do, but if other people do understand, I think it's clear, I'm fine to go with it.
Yeah, it's unclear. I don't know if someone who authored this. Is it okay if I just delete it? Not hearing anyone speak up.
I'm in favor. This is Jerry. Delete it.
Okay.
Me too. This is Gina.
Okay, number 81, and we're at the very end.
Hi, Jim. This is Ioma. Can we make it black? I feel like my eyes are turning. The font. Thank you. Sorry.
Yeah, and it was just. I think it was just put in that way just to make clear that they were.
Yeah. Yeah. That's very good. Thank you.
So, any questions or concerns about 81, or is it okay?
This is Gina. I think it's good.
Okay, I think we're 2 minutes over, so I failed. We have not gotten on target on time, but we're close.
You were great.
But you had lots of technical difficulties, so I think we have an excuse.
So I don't know if we turn it back over to you, Karen, before we formally start the recommendation process.
Yes, thank you, Jane. So I'm just going to welcome people back to this portion of the NAC Differential Privacy virtual meeting. And at this time, James Tucker will present the NAC recommendations.
Thanks so much, Karen. And we're going to start with going through the differential privacy recommendations. Bear with me for 1 second while I pull up the correct documents. And I have to go to the beginning. And so, again, I'm not going to read the preamble. I will just simply read the recommendation, and then I will call. We're going to do this in groups of 5 again because I think it moves it along a little bit faster. And then I'll ask folks to unmute, and we'll do it ayes, nays, and then anyone who abstains. So the first one, number 1, the NAC recommends that in evaluating the application of the disclosure avoidance system to the PL 94171 redistricting data set, including the algorithm and the privacy loss budget, the Census Bureau and the Data Stewardship Executive Policy Committee, or DCEP, consider priority uses that require the highest level of accuracy, including A, redistricting of all elected bodies, including those with very small populations, B, funding formulas and appropriations, including for communities with very small populations, C, research in public health, that should probably be research in public health uses. Oh, I guess maybe that's clear with, never mind. It's clear from the beginning. Research in public health, including for communities with very small populations. And D, tribal, state, county, and local level governance, including in places with very small populations. Number 2, just reading the recommendation. The NAC recommends that in evaluating the application of the disclosure avoidance system to the PL 94171 redistricting data set, including the algorithm and the privacy loss budget, the Census Bureau and the Data Stewardship Executive Policy, or DCEP Committee, consider the impact that even small levels of inaccuracy can have on tribal communities in places with 500 people or less. Number 3, the NAC recommends that in evaluating the application of the disclosure avoidance system to the PL 94171 redistricting data set, including the algorithm and the privacy loss budget, the Census Bureau and the Data Stewardship Executive Policy Committee, or DCEP, consider the level of variance between the actual count and the adjusted count at the census block level. Recommendation number 4, the NAC recommends that in evaluating the application of the disclosure avoidance system to the PL 94171 redistricting data set, including the algorithm and the privacy loss budget, the Census Bureau and the Data Stewardship Executive Policy, or DCEP Committee, consider the level of variance between the actual count and the adjusted count for small political boundaries added through the voting district program, such as voting districts or precincts. Number 5, and the last of our first set, the NAC recommends that in evaluating the application of the disclosure avoidance system to the PL 94171 redistricting data set, including the algorithm and the privacy loss budget. The Census Bureau and the Data Stewardship Executive Policy, or DSEP Committee, consider the level of variance between the actual count and the adjusted count for all minority groups in less populated places, and not just the largest minority group. Okay, with that, we're going to pause. We're going to have everyone on mute. And all in favor of recommendations 1 through 5 on differential privacy, please say aye.
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 Aye. Aye.
Any opposed, say nay. And any abstentions? Not hearing any, please mute, and then we'll go through the next 5. Recommendation number 6. The NAC recommends that the Census Bureau continue to work with federal, state, and local agencies, tribal nations, and other outside stakeholders to collect and study cases across a wide range of uses, variables, and geographies for the PL 94171 redistricting data set and for subsequent data releases. Recommendation number 7. The NAC recommends that the Census Bureau provide the public with a concrete measure for the loss of privacy associated with adjustments to epsilon to improve accuracy so that more informed decisions can be made about the relative trade-offs between accuracy and privacy. Number 8, the NAC recommends that the Census Bureau continue its efforts to regularly communicate updates and engage various stakeholders and user groups during the decision-making process for setting the privacy loss budget and its allocation. Recommendation number 9, the NAC recommends the Census Bureau be transparent and actively engage with all stakeholders and user groups as it makes its final decisions about the algorithm used for the PL 94171 redistricting data set and going forward with all remaining products. And number 10, closing out this group, recommendation number 10, the NAC recommends the Census Bureau communicate the factors used by the Data Stewardship Executive Policy, or DSEP Committee, to set the privacy loss budget, also known as the level of epsilon. So at that point, everyone please unmute, and all of those in favor of recommendations 6 through 10, please so indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Any opposed, please say nay. And any abstentions? Not hearing any. Moving on to the next group, please mute. Recommendation number 11. The NAC recommends that the Census Bureau publish 2020 census data handbooks for data users targeted to different audiences such as American Indian, Alaska Native, federal agencies, data for rural areas, media, local government officials, etc., that parallel the handbooks created for the American Community Survey. Recommendation number 12, the NAC recommends the Census Bureau supply differential privacy metrics for children to better understand how differential privacy will impact data quality. Recommendation 13, the NAC recommends that the Census Bureau establish the following accuracy target for differential privacy in children. Quote, for all geographic units larger than census blocks for which data are reported, after the census data has been subjected to differential privacy, the results for children should be within 5% of the true value 95% of the time, and no error should be more than 10%, close quotes. Recommendation 14, the NAC recommends the Census Bureau determine an accuracy target for differential privacy in children of color, such as Black, Hispanic, Asian, American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islander. Recommendation 15, the NAC recommends that the Census Bureau implement differential privacy in a way that does not break the link between children and adults in a household. So at this point, please unmute, and all of those in favor of recommendations 11 through 15, please so indicate by saying aye.
Aye. Aye.
Aye. And any opposed, please say nay. And any abstentions? Okay, recommendations 11 through 15 are adopted. Please mute. And going to the next set of 5, recommendation 16, the NAC joins NCAI in recommending that the accuracy and usability of American Indian, Alaska Native, tribal geography data improve significantly in the final 2020 census data, with any reductions in accuracy or worsening of error metrics being being unacceptable. Recommendation 17, The NAC joins NCAI in recommending that the Census Bureau ensure that the total population count in each AIAN tribal geography be held invariant, in other words, equal to the actual count, and that errors and other decennial demographic and housing characteristics must have no more than 5% error rates, regardless of the size of the geography. Recommendation 18, the NAC joins NCAI in recommending that the Census Bureau follow other standard practices of suppressing counts under 10 if there is a risk to privacy, but this should be done in consultation with the affected American Indian, Alaska Native tribal nations, if applicable, and other affected groups. Recommendation 19, and we'll remove the highlight. I will remove that later. We're going to group these as more general recommendations. So number 19, the NAC joins NCAI and others, should be in other organizations, in recommending that the Census Bureau ensure that American Indian tribal nations and other ethnic and racial population groups that have actual counts in the 2020 census raw data never end up with zero counts in the final data set. And number 20, the NAC joins NCAI and other organizations in recommending that consideration be given for the priority use cases listed above, and the Census Bureau must demonstrate how they have updated the application of privacy protections to ensure that AIAN tribal nations and other ethnic and racial population groups and groups working on behalf of children have accurate and usable data for all of those purposes. So at this point, please unmute, and all of those in favor of recommendations 16 through 20, please so indicate by saying aye.
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 Any opposed, say nay. And any abstentions? Okay, please mute. Recommendations 16 through 20 are adopted. The next 5, recommendation 21, the NAC joins NCAI and other organizations in recommending that the global privacy loss budget be increased for the PL 94171 redistricting data set. And I'm just going to add that in. Number 22, the NAC joins NCAI, the National Urban League, and other organizations in recommending that the accuracy for all racial and ethnic groups match that of non-Hispanic white data in the 2020 census to be fair and equitable. Number 23, the NAC joins NCAI and other organizations in recommending that the Census Bureau conduct additional public meetings and tribal consultations to obtain feedback from tribal nations and stakeholders from other ethnic and racial groups and groups working on behalf of children about the decisions made by DCEP and its implications, with the information to be communicated in an accessible format for individuals who may lack an understanding for any of the methods the Bureau is using to balance privacy with accuracy. Recommendation 24, the NAC recommends that the Bureau revisit and abandon its policy decision to ensure consistency between redistricting data release and the demographic housing characteristic data release. If doing so would secure a greater level of accuracy and disclosure avoidance system protected data for either release. And the last of this group, number 25, the NAC recommends that the Bureau publicly release the identity and characteristics of all voting/electoral districts evaluated in the course of developing the differential privacy algorithm in Epsilon. Characteristics should include urban/rural, voting age proportion, citizenship proportion, race/ethnicity proportions, total population size, and socioeconomic diversity. So at this point, please unmute. And all of those in favor of recommendations 21 through 25, please so indicate by saying aye.
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 And any opposed, please say nay. And any abstentions? You're not hearing any, please mute. We just have, I believe, 2 more in this. Recommendations 21 through 25 are adopted. Recommendation 26, the NAC recommends the Census Bureau publicly release data demonstrating how previous disclosure avoidance system or swapping in 2010 may have affected geographies/electoral districts that were majority minority appearing not to be majority minority. definition of majority minority should employ population percentages identified by the United States Department of Justice as generally identifying effective majority minority districts for each specific minority group. And then the last of the differential privacy recommendations, number 27, the NAC recommends that the Census Bureau consider impacts the application of differential privacy will have on already undercounted populations affected heavily by the differential undercount, including but not limited to Black men and young Black children, the Hispanic population, the American Indian Alaska Native population, the Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander and other population, and other hard-to-count populations. And with that, please unmute, and all of those in favor of recommendations 26 and 27, please so indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. And any opposed, please say nay. And any abstentions? Okay, with that, recommendations 26 through 27 are adopted, and all of the differential privacy recommendations 21 through 27 are adopted. And I'm going to shift gears, and we are going to go over to the spring holdovers. So, and again, the numbers may be, we'll just use these numbers for the sake of getting through this. We may have to adjust them. Let me go ahead and add in a number. But again, bear in mind, this is just so we know what's been passed and what has not. So recommendation 65, holdover 65, the NAC recommends inclusion of an item in the Household Pulse Survey that addresses household members' inability to take part in work experience or internships needed to complete a program during the pandemic that will facilitate understanding of barriers to educational attainment. Holdover number 67, the NAC recommends inclusion of an item in the Household Pulse Survey that addresses household members' inability to obtain a certificate during the pandemic that will facilitate understanding of barriers to educational attainment. Holdover number 70, the NAC recommends adding the following measures to the Household Pulse Survey: experiencing or being the target of verbal aggression and physical violence, reluctance or hesitation to seeking medical care for health issues. And with that, I'm going to actually switch over to another document. We will actually keep all of these straight. Oops, wrong one. So we're going to take these a little bit out of order, but these were the order in which they were addressed. So holdover recommendation 78A, the NAC recommends the Census Bureau undertake a comprehensive review of the community resilience estimates, including comparing the measures, comprising it with other vulnerability, opportunity, and persistence poverty indices, which have been constructed using ACS data at the tract level. And I will just mention, just for the sake of making this easier, unless someone disagrees, I'm just going to go through all of the holdover recommendations. We'll just simply vote on all of them all together, because given the number, it'll just make it a little bit easier. Number 78B, the NAC recommends the Census Bureau review the variability in the CRE and other measures, both by county and by census tract, and indicate the differences in the identification of high need, such as high social vulnerability, persistent poverty, child opportunity, community resiliency, geographies by census tract and by county. Number 78C, the NAC recommends that the Census Bureau make use of the expertise on the NAC and its actions to further develop the CRE, as well as other experts in organizations which have constructed indices from the ACS. Number 78D, the NAC recommends that the census use age, race, and ethnicity measures as important contextual measures in composite indices or estimates, but not as factors used in the CRE index to assess risk per se. Number 78E, the census should be, I'm sorry, it actually is below. The NAC recommends that the Census Bureau encourage users to examine the indicators making up any index or estimate, as well as the index or estimate itself, making both easily available. Holdover recommendation number 75. The NAC recommends that as research develops and the Census Bureau acquires additional data and experience in working with CREs, additional risk factors and measures which may predict resilience be identified for more robust estimates. Number 76. NAC recommends that the Census Bureau examine CRE's utility in developing guidelines for distribution of resources, for both tangible and non-tangible resources, if possible, to also validate measures to ensure equitable distribution. Number 79, the NAC recommends that the Census Bureau identify communities that are found to be resilient and examine what is taking place in those places that make it possible: social capital, community connections, policies, etc. Holdover number 80, the NAC recommends that the CRE framework, we could correct that, include protective promotive factors such as access to resources, family/community support, economic, racial, ethnic integration, high income, and educated minority populations. Holdover recommendation number 81, the NAC recommends that the Census Bureau gather input on the CRE from various entities, public, private, community, and civil rights groups to assess inclusion of resilience factors, implications of use in the CRE for distributing resources equitably, and examine its effectiveness. And with that, we just have 5 more recommendations that I'm going to go to at the end, 4 or 5 more. So holdover recommendations under young children, and again, these numbers may be a little bit off. Number 83, the NAC recommends that the Bureau reinstate its task force on the undercount of young children and make it a permanent structure. Holdover recommendation 84, again, these numbers are duplicative of what we've talked about. The NAC recommends that the Census Bureau continue to collect data on person 5. The ECS roster is generally completed from oldest to youngest person in the household, so the move to collect less data on person 5 will likely impact the completeness of data for young children than on adults. Recommendation 85, the NAC recommends that the Census Bureau develop and make available an additional table or tables for reporting American Community Survey at the tract, county, state, and national levels that includes information of most relevance to children and families. And then finally, holdover recommendation number 86, the NAC recommends that the Census Bureau produce a report showing variations both across and within counties in terms of persistent poverty, geographic areas, geographies which have experienced poverty over 20% in the 3 most recent decades, and the differences between using county and census tract information to identify such areas. The committee further recommends that the report provide additional information about those census tracts, including information of most relevance to children and families. So with that, please unmute, and all of those in favor of adopting the holdover recommendations, please so indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say nay. And any abstentions? Okay, not hearing any, we've actually managed to get through all of our holdover recommendations and all of our differential privacy recommendations with 16 minutes to spare. We not only were on target on time, but actually a little bit early. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Karen Battle.
All right. Thank you, James, so much. We appreciate that. So actually, this concludes the NAC Differential Privacy Virtual Meeting proceedings. And so the meeting is now adjourned. Thank you, everybody.
That concludes today's
Thank
conference.
you.
You may disconnect
Thank you.
at this time, and thank you for joining.